The quiet neighborhood of Denver, Colorado, was still bathed in the late afternoon sun when the 911 call came in. The voice on the other end of the line was trembling, desperate. "My wife! She's unconscious in the bathroom." The dispatcher's voice remained calm, trained for these moments. "Sir, is she breathing?" A pause, then a shaky exhale. I, I don't know. She's cold. I think she's not breathing." The urgency in his voice was enough to mobilize emergency responders within seconds. Sirens split the tranquil air as an ambulance and police cars sped through the streets, stopping in front of a well-kept two-story home. The front door was already ajar, revealing a man standing motionless at the entrance. He was in his mid-40s, wearing a simple t-shirt and sweatpants, his face pale and sweat beading on his forehead. "Please help me. My wife is inside." His voice cracked, eyes darting anxiously toward the hallway leading to the master bathroom. The paramedics rushed past him, their boots clicking against the polished wooden floor. The house smelled of fresh linen and lavender, a domestic, almost serene scent, utterly disconnected from the scene unfolding inside. And then they saw her, a woman sprawled across the cool tile floor, her limbs still. She was dressed in a damp nightgown, her auburn hair lying in a tangled mess around her face. Her lips were slightly parted, her skin unusually pale. One of the paramedics knelt beside her, pressing two fingers to her neck. A moment later, a solemn shake of the head. "No pulse. She's gone." The declaration settled in the air like a lead weight. The husband let out a strangled sob, collapsing onto the nearest wall, his body racked with grief. The officers exchanged wary glances. Something about the scene felt off. Sergeant Davis, a seasoned detective with 20 years on the force, stepped forward, his trained eyes scanning the room. A bathroom should have signs of use: steam clinging to the mirror, damp footprints leading out, a towel hastily thrown aside. But here the air was dry. The shower stall stood spotless. The tub was empty, except for a few stray droplets on the porcelain edge. Yet her husband had said she had just taken a bath. His gaze drifted lower. The woman's hair was not dripping wet, but only slightly damp, as if it had been wetted, not washed. More importantly, her skin felt unnaturally cold, a detail that raised an immediate red flag. She had been dead for longer than her husband claimed. Davis crouched down beside the paramedics. The body's posture was peculiar, unnatural for someone who had supposedly slipped and fallen. There was no visible head injury, no signs of a struggle, no overturned objects. The neatness of the room contradicted the narrative of an accident. One of the forensic specialists began a preliminary assessment. As he lifted one of the woman's hands, his expression tightened. There were faint bruises along her forearms, barely noticeable but unmistakably there. Davis straightened, his gut instinct kicking in. "Sir, can you walk us through exactly what happened?" His voice was steady, controlled. The husband, Robert Bob Feldman, wiped his face, his hands trembling. I came home an hour ago. I called out for her, but she didn't answer. So I went upstairs, checked the bathroom, and she was just lying there. She wasn't moving, and the water was still running. I tried to wake her up, but she wouldn't respond. That's when I called 911. His explanation was fluid, rehearsed even. Davis had heard countless accounts like this before. Grieving spouses who sounded just a little too composed. "Did your wife have any medical conditions? A history of fainting, seizures, heart disease?" Bob shook his head. She was healthy. Healthy. Yet here she was. The forensic specialist moved discreetly around the scene, taking photographs. When he leaned down to check for signs of petechial hemorrhaging, a common indicator of asphyxiation, his brow furrowed. Davis noticed. His mind began threading the inconsistencies together. The dry air, the undisturbed bathroom, the timing that didn't align. And now, bruises. "How long were you gone before you found her?" Davis asked. Bob hesitated, then cleared his throat. "I was out for a few hours, running errands." "Alone?" "Yes." His answer was quick. Davis held his gaze. "And your wife was home the entire time?" Bob nodded. A creeping tension filled the room. The forensic specialist carefully examined the bruising along Stacy's collarbone, his expression growing more serious. The bruises were subtle, easy to miss in a quick glance. But to trained eyes, they told a different story, a story that didn't involve slipping in the bathtub. Davis kept his tone neutral, but inside his instincts were already turning. Something had happened here, and the husband, his tears, his tremors, his carefully placed details, was standing at the center of it. Outside, the sun had started to set, casting long shadows across the neighborhood. Inside, the temperature felt colder, the weight of suspicion settling like a fog over the pristine, silent home. This was no ordinary accident. This was something much darker, and it was only the beginning. The quiet hum of activity filled the house as forensic technicians moved methodically through the scene. The crime scene photographer clicked away, capturing every inch of the bathroom from different angles. The sterile scent of antiseptic mixed with the faint lavender aroma lingering in the air, an odd contrast to the cold body on the floor. Outside, the sun was dipping lower, casting long, eerie shadows through the windows. Sergeant Davis stood near the doorway, arms crossed, observing the details. The facts weren't adding up. Stacy Feldman, 44 years old, reportedly healthy, had been found unresponsive in her own bathroom. Her husband, Bob Feldman, claimed she had drowned or slipped in the shower. But the crime scene told another story, one that was whispering of something far more sinister. The medical examiner had arrived and was performing an initial assessment. He knelt beside Stacy, carefully lifting her arm. The bruises were faint but visible, light discolorations along her forearms, the kind that suggested she had been grabbed. Not forcefully enough to leave deep, obvious marks, but enough to suggest resistance. It was a small but crucial detail. Davis turned his attention back to Bob, who was sitting on the edge of the bed in the master bedroom, his face buried in his hands. His sobs had quieted, replaced by a vacant stare. He looked exhausted, but Davis had seen that expression before. It wasn't just grief. There was something else beneath it, the weight of something unspoken. A uniformed officer approached, his voice low. "Sergeant, there's something off about the timeline. The husband said he was gone for a few hours, but the body's colder than it should be. She's been dead longer than that." Davis nodded, the pieces clicking into place in his mind. He had worked enough cases to recognize when someone was trying to manipulate the clock. The temperature of the body didn't lie. It was a scientific truth that exposed deception. The medical examiner stood and addressed the room. "Lividity is setting in. That means she's been dead for several hours, not just one or two." He gestured toward the bathroom counter. "And there's no sign of struggle. If she slipped, there should be more disturbance. Towels on the floor, broken bottles, something knocked over. This place is almost too clean." Davis stepped forward, scanning the room again. The untouched surfaces, the neatly folded towels, the absence of water splashed across the floor. It all felt staged, like a scene arranged for an audience. The sergeant moved back to Bob, his voice measured. "You said you were out running errands. Where exactly were you?" Bob hesitated, then rattled off a list. "Grocery store, dry cleaners, gas station. Did anyone see you?" A pause, a flicker of hesitation in Bob's eyes before he shook his head. I don't know. I was just in and out." Davis studied him. It was an answer meant to sound casual, but it was too vague. People remembered running errands. People remembered whether they interacted with someone, even briefly. And if Bob had been out, alone, without an alibi, then his timeline was already starting to crumble. An officer re-entered the house holding a plastic evidence bag. "Sergeant, found this in the laundry room." Davis took it, holding it up to the light. Inside was a damp towel. A small but crucial stain stood out. A faint, almost imperceptible smear of what looked like blood. Bob noticed and instantly tensed. "Is that from today?" Davis asked, his voice neutral. Bob's throat bobbed as he swallowed. I don't know. Maybe. She showered every day. Maybe she cut herself shaving." The excuses were piling up, but none of them explained the inconsistencies. The dry hair, the colder than expected body temperature, the strange bruising, the too clean bathroom. Davis exhaled slowly. This wasn't a straightforward case. This wasn't an accident. The question was no longer whether Stacy had simply died in her home. The question was, what really happened behind that bathroom door? The next morning, the Denver medical examiner's office was silent, except for the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead. The sterile smell of antiseptic filled the air, blending with the cold steel of the autopsy table. Dr. Elaine Porter adjusted her gloves and took a steady breath before beginning her work. Stacy Feldman's body lay motionless beneath the harsh lights, her skin pale, her expression frozen in time. Death, as always, was silent, but it never lacked a story to tell. Sergeant Davis stood behind the observation glass, his arms crossed as he watched. He had attended more autopsies than he could count, but each one carried its own weight. Some spoke plainly: gunshot wounds, stab injuries, blunt force trauma. Others, like this one, required patience to decipher. Bob Feldman had insisted it was an accident, but the details weren't aligning, and Davis had learned long ago that the dead often contradicted the living. Dr. Porter began with the lividity, the way blood settled in the body after death. If Stacy had died where she was found, the patterns of pooling should match the bathroom floor, but they didn't. Instead, they suggested she had been lying in a different position for a significant time before being moved, a discrepancy too significant to ignore. She worked methodically, scanning for signs of trauma that weren't immediately visible. The bruising along Stacy's arms was more pronounced under direct light. It wasn't the random discoloration of a simple fall. It was deliberate, indicative of force. Someone had gripped her, hard. Davis felt his jaw tighten as Porter continued her examination. Then a pause. Her fingers traced along Stacy's collarbone, lingering at a faint discoloration near her throat. Under normal lighting, it had been nearly imperceptible, but under the focused glare of the autopsy lamps, it was clear. Strangulation, not the kind that would leave deep, obvious imprints, but enough pressure to restrict airflow, enough force to ensure that she had fought for breath before slipping into darkness. Davis inhaled slowly, the confirmation settling in his mind. Bob had lied. There was no accident. Dr. Porter moved on, examining the interior of Stacy's mouth and throat. No signs of drowning, no excess water in her lungs. The absence of pulmonary edema, something almost always present in drowning victims, confirmed what Davis already suspected. Then came the internal findings. The moment Dr. Porter made the incision, the truth became undeniable. Beneath the skin, bruising extended deeper than it had appeared externally. The hemorrhaging in Stacy's neck muscles was unmistakable, her larynx showing fractures consistent with manual strangulation. This wasn't a slip in the bathtub. It was something intentional, something violent. By the time the examination concluded, there were no lingering doubts. Cause of death: manual strangulation. The words were clinical, devoid of emotion, but to Davis, they were damning. By midday, investigators returned to the Feldman residence with a search warrant. The house felt eerily still, the air thick with something unseen. It had once been a home, but now it was nothing more than a carefully curated crime scene, a staged version of reality, arranged by someone who thought he had outsmarted the inevitable. The living room was undisturbed. The kitchen carried the faint smell of stale coffee, a mug still sitting on the counter, half full. Upstairs, the bedroom was untouched, the bed perfectly made, as if Stacy had never laid in it the night before she died. But the bathroom, that was where the illusion started to break apart. Forensic specialists worked in silence, moving with practiced precision. A spray of luminol coated the tiles, reacting under the UV light. Within seconds, faint blue flickers illuminated the floor, traces of something that had been wiped away. Blood. Not enough to be immediately visible, but enough to confirm that something violent had happened here. Then in the laundry room, another technician made a discovery. The washing machine contained clothes that had recently been washed. Among them, a towel, the same towel that had been found the night before. Further testing confirmed what everyone feared. The towel had absorbed blood, and the DNA matched Stacy's. At that moment, the investigation shifted. It was no longer a question of whether Bob had been involved. It was a question of how he had done it, and why. Detectives arrived at Bob's office later that afternoon. His demeanor had changed. The day before, he had been emotional, cooperative. Now there was a guardedness to him, a layer of restraint behind his eyes. He repeated his version of events. He had left to run errands. Stacy had been fine when he left. When he returned, she was unresponsive. He spoke in short, measured sentences, as if sticking to a script. The problem was, the script was already unraveling. Bob, the autopsy report shows your wife didn't drown. There was no water in her lungs. A flicker of something in his expression. A microsecond of hesitation before he forced his features into something neutral. And those bruises? They weren't from a fall. She had defensive wounds. The kind you get when you fight back. Silence. And Bob, there's one more thing. A pause. Stacy was dead for hours before you called 911. The room went still. Bob's breath hitched, so slight that someone untrained might not have noticed. But Davis noticed. He always noticed. For the first time, Bob Feldman had no answer. The morning air was crisp as Sergeant Davis leaned back in his chair, flipping through the thick file in front of him. The manila folder was worn at the edges, stuffed with documents, reports, and notes from interviews. It wasn't just about what had happened in the last 24 hours. It was about what had led up to it. Because murder, especially one this calculated, was rarely spontaneous. It was the final act of a story that had been building for years, and Bob Feldman's story was unraveling faster than anyone had anticipated. As Davis scanned the pages, the pattern became evident. Bob had not been a perfect husband. In fact, he had not even been a faithful one. Infidelity had always been a shadow in their marriage. Stacy's friends had spoken candidly in their initial interviews. She had suspected her husband of cheating before, but she had never found concrete proof. He was careful, secretive. He knew how to cover his tracks, or at least he had for a while. 2 days before her death, Stacy had received a message that changed everything. A woman, one of many Bob had met through dating apps, had reached out, unaware that he was married. She had pieced it together, found Stacy's information, and decided she deserved to know. The message had been direct, a confession laced with regret. I didn't know he was married. I'm so sorry. You deserve better. Stacy had responded. Thank you for telling me. I'm done with him. Those were her last known words about the matter. Hours later, she was dead. Davis exhaled slowly, staring at the printed exchange. The timing was damning. The confrontation must have happened that evening. Stacy had discovered the truth. And not just any truth. She had discovered the full extent of Bob's deception. The question wasn't whether they had argued. The question was how far it had gone. Detectives began tracing Bob's digital footprint. His phone records painted a telling picture. Calls to various women, dating apps re-downloaded, late-night texts erased but still recoverable through forensic analysis. His double life was no longer hidden beneath the surface. It was now in full view. Then came the financial records. The expenses didn't align with the image of a loyal husband. Lavish dinners at restaurants Stacy had never mentioned. Hotel stays charged to an account Stacy didn't even know existed. The facade of a grieving widower was slipping away. Investigators expanded their interviews. A former colleague described Bob as charming but distant. Another woman, one who had briefly dated him before discovering his marital status, recounted how easily he lied, how convincing he was even when caught. It wasn't just that Bob cheated. It was that he didn't believe he would ever face consequences. And then came the real breakthrough, an old police report. Davis ran his fingers over the faded ink, the details from years prior. A call had been made to authorities about a domestic disturbance at the Feldman household. The complainant, Stacy herself, but no charges had been filed. The report had been buried beneath time and bureaucracy. The officer who had responded had noted that Stacy seemed shaken, but unwilling to press charges. She had downplayed the situation, called it an argument that had escalated. The officer had listed it as a verbal dispute, nothing more. But the report included something chilling. The wife stated she felt unsafe, that he was not the man she thought he was. Davis felt a chill run down his spine. She had known. Maybe not about the murder, not then. But she had known what Bob was capable of, and now she was dead. With each uncovered detail, the case was shifting from suspicion to certainty. Detectives returned to Bob for another round of questioning. His story hadn't changed, but his demeanor had. The nervous energy was creeping in, the controlled grief starting to crack under the weight of evidence. He had rehearsed his version of events too well, and now the details were slipping. The timeline was collapsing. The forensic evidence was damning. And his past? That was the final nail in the coffin. This wasn't a grieving husband. This was a man who had been leading a double life, who had been exposed, and who had done the unthinkable to keep his world from falling apart. Bob Feldman had not lost his wife in a tragic accident. He had murdered her. And now he was running out of places to hide. The evidence against Bob Feldman was growing like an unstoppable tide, swallowing the carefully constructed facade he had built over the years. Lies that had once been easy to conceal were now unraveling under the weight of science and scrutiny. But in the modern age, where everything left a trace, it was only a matter of time before investigators uncovered something even more damning: his digital footprint. Technology had a way of betraying even the most calculated criminals. Every call made, every text sent, every movement tracked by GPS or surveillance was a breadcrumb leading directly to the truth. And Bob Feldman had left plenty of breadcrumbs. Detectives had already uncovered his history of infidelity through dating apps and text messages. But now they wanted to see where he had been in the hours leading up to Stacy's death, and more importantly, the hours after. His phone records, credit card transactions, and even the onboard GPS system in his car were all subjected to forensic analysis. The findings were chilling. Bob had claimed he left home in the morning, ran errands, and returned later to find Stacy unresponsive. A tragic discovery, a freak accident. That was his narrative. But the data told another story. His phone had been inactive for nearly an hour in the middle of the afternoon, an unusual gap for someone who was otherwise in constant contact with multiple women. It was as if, for that brief window of time, he had deliberately gone dark. But his car's GPS system, which recorded movements even when a phone was off, told a different story. He hadn't been running errands. He had driven out to a secluded park on the outskirts of Denver. The location wasn't on his usual routes. There were no stores or gas stations nearby. It was an area known for its dense foliage, far from security cameras or foot traffic. He had spent nearly 40 minutes there before returning home and making his frantic 911 call. Why? Investigators scoured the park with search teams, looking for any evidence. Perhaps discarded items, clothing, anything that could tie him to that location. And then, near a cluster of trees, they found it: a plastic bag. Inside, neatly wrapped and weighted down with stones, were Stacy's missing personal items: a pair of earrings, a necklace she was known to wear daily, and most disturbingly, the torn strap of a nightgown. Detectives stared at the bag in silence. Bob hadn't just staged Stacy's death. He had attempted to erase any sign of a struggle. The presence of the nightgown strap suggested something far worse than a fall in the bathroom. It suggested a physical altercation, a violent one. The evidence now pointed to a terrifying sequence of events. Bob had likely confronted Stacy after she learned of his infidelity. They had argued. Things escalated. He had strangled her, and in the aftermath, he had carefully manipulated the scene to make it appear as if she had simply slipped and fallen. He had removed incriminating items, driven out to dispose of them, then returned to feign a discovery and call 911. But technology had caught up with him. Back at the station, investigators continued to comb through his online activity. His search history revealed a disturbing pattern: queries about forensic evidence, questions about how long bruises lasted post-mortem, whether strangulation could be mistaken for an accident. It was premeditated. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was a calculated act of control, carried out by a man who believed he was untouchable. When detectives confronted him with the evidence, Bob didn't react at first. His silence was telling, his fingers tapping anxiously on the metal table in the interrogation room. The arrogance, the charm, both had faded. All that was left was the raw fear of a man who knew the walls were closing in. For years he had lied, he had deceived, he had manipulated. But the truth had finally caught up to him. And this time, there was nowhere left to hide. The walls inside the Denver Police Department's interrogation room were bare, painted a dull gray that seemed to absorb the tension in the air. A single overhead light cast a harsh glow over the metal table, reflecting off the surface in a way that left no room for shadows, no space for deception. Sergeant Davis sat across from Bob Feldman, watching him closely. The man who had spent years crafting a double life was now facing the consequences of his own lies. Forensic evidence had unraveled his carefully constructed alibi, exposing inconsistencies that no grieving husband should have. The autopsy had confirmed that Stacy had not drowned. The GPS data had placed Bob in a remote location before calling 911. The recovered plastic bag filled with Stacy's belongings had suggested something far worse than an accident. And now Bob's search history, his digital blueprint for murder, painted a chilling picture of premeditation. Davis had seen this before. Not the crime itself, but the way a suspect's demeanor shifted under the weight of undeniable evidence. At first there was shock, then denial. Then the fight to regain control. Some cracked under pressure immediately. Others doubled down, grasping at explanations that made less and less sense. Bob, it seemed, was the latter. His posture was tense, hands resting on the table, fingers tapping an uneven rhythm against the cold steel. His breathing was controlled, his jaw tight. He hadn't asked for a lawyer, not yet. That alone told Davis something. Bob still thought he could outmaneuver the truth. Outside the room, a team of detectives worked tirelessly, piecing together every moment leading up to Stacy's death. The timeline, once murky, was now coming into focus. Bob had left the house that morning as usual, but by midday, Stacy had already learned the truth about his affair. The message from the other woman had been her breaking point. She had confided in a friend that she planned to confront him that evening. She was tired of the lies, tired of pretending, and, perhaps most dangerously for Bob, she had decided she was done with him. A woman leaving a man like Bob Feldman wasn't just about divorce. It was about power, and Bob had spent years ensuring he was the one in control. Detectives had found no signs of forced entry at the home, no evidence that an outsider had been involved, no indication that this was anything other than a domestic dispute turned deadly. The bruises on Stacy's arms told a silent story, one of resistance. She had fought. The broken cartilage in her throat confirmed what the detectives already knew. Bob hadn't lost his wife in a tragic accident. He had taken her life. The disposal of her personal items in a remote area suggested forethought. The cleaned bathroom, the hastily washed laundry, the carefully crafted 911 call, it all pointed to a man who had tried, desperately, to stage the scene. But evidence never stayed buried for long. One by one, the puzzle pieces had fallen into place, and now Bob was running out of time. The moment had arrived. Outside the Feldman residence, the sky was a dull gray, heavy with the weight of an impending storm. The air was thick, suffocating, as if the world itself knew what was about to happen. Inside, the house remained eerily still, untouched since the last time detectives had combed through it. The pristine white walls, the carefully arranged furniture, everything was staged, just like the life Bob Feldman had so meticulously constructed. But the truth had already seeped into every corner, cracking the illusion he had tried so hard to maintain. In the Denver Police Department's command center, officers reviewed their final notes. The case was ironclad now. Physical evidence, digital forensics, the autopsy report, and most damning of all, the unraveling timeline that proved Bob's deception. The arrest warrant had been signed. There would be no more interrogation, no more calculated explanations. The time for questions had passed. Now there was only the truth. Detective Davis had been through this process countless times, yet there was always a distinct weight to cases like this. Cases where the suspect had built a carefully controlled life, only for it to collapse under the weight of their own actions. He had seen many reactions in his career: denial, rage, silence. But he had a feeling about Bob. Bob Feldman wasn't the type to lash out. He wasn't the type to panic. He was the type who truly believed he could talk his way out of anything. A team of officers moved toward Bob's office, where he had continued working as if nothing had changed. He was still playing the role of a grieving husband, still trying to project the image of a man wronged by fate rather than one who had orchestrated the entire tragedy. As they entered, Bob looked up from his desk, his expression shifting almost imperceptibly. Surprise, annoyance, and then something colder: calculation. It was the briefest flicker, but Davis caught it. The subtle shift in Bob's posture, the way his fingers tightened around the pen he had been holding. He wasn't shocked. He had known this moment was coming. One of the officers stepped forward, voice steady. "Robert Feldman, you are under arrest for the murder of Stacy Feldman." There was a beat of silence, a moment where time seemed to stretch, where Bob's carefully maintained composure teetered on the edge of collapse. But then he exhaled slowly, setting his pen down with deliberate precision. He didn't protest, didn't demand an explanation, didn't even ask what evidence they had against him. Instead, he offered the faintest of nods, as if acknowledging an inevitability he had long prepared for. Davis studied him closely. This was a man who had spent years perfecting the art of deception, of manipulation. Even now, even in this moment, he was calculating his next move. Bob allowed himself to be handcuffed without resistance. His face remained composed, but his knuckles were white, his jaw set just a little too tightly. As they escorted him through the halls of his office, employees turned to watch, their murmurs rippling like a slow-moving current. The once respected man, the grieving widower, the devoted husband, all of it had been a lie. Outside, reporters had already gathered, their cameras flashing as Bob was led to the waiting police car. The news had spread fast. An affluent man accused of murdering his wife, a case that had once been written off as an accident, now turning into something far darker. The whispers had begun long before the arrest, fueled by the inconsistencies, the rumors, the slow drip of truth that had begun to seep through the cracks. Now there was no more speculation. There was only justice. As the car pulled away, Davis remained behind, standing on the curb, watching as the last remnants of Bob Feldman's facade were stripped away. There were still battles ahead, the court case, the media frenzy, the inevitable attempts at defense. But this was the first step. Stacy Feldman's story would not end with a lie. It would end with the truth. And Bob Feldman, for all his careful planning, would never be able to escape it. The courtroom was a different kind of battlefield, one where words were weapons and perception could mean the difference between freedom and a lifetime behind bars. For weeks, Bob Feldman had been sitting in a holding cell, awaiting what he undoubtedly saw as his moment to regain control. He had remained silent during his booking, offering no admissions, no outbursts. If anything, his composure had only reinforced what investigators already suspected. He wasn't grieving, he was planning. The media had seized on the story with relentless energy. The public had turned against him. The man once seen as a respected community figure was now plastered across news stations, his face filling television screens with headlines that left no room for ambiguity. Bob Feldman charged with wife's murder, deception unraveled. The prosecution was ready. The evidence against him was overwhelming. But Bob had hired one of the best defense attorneys in the state, a man known for his ability to twist even the most damning cases into stories of misunderstanding and wrongful accusation. From the moment the preliminary hearings began, it became clear that Bob's defense strategy hinged on two things: casting doubt on the forensic evidence and painting himself as a victim of a rush to judgment. The defense wasted no time in challenging the autopsy findings. They brought in their own medical expert, who suggested that Stacy's bruises could have been the result of a medical condition, that strangulation markings were inconclusive, and that her cause of death could not be determined with certainty. The prosecution fired back, methodically dismantling these claims. The lead forensic examiner took the stand, breaking down the science in a way that was impossible to refute. The lack of water in Stacy's lungs, the telltale signs of asphyxiation, the bruising on her arms indicative of restraint, the broken cartilage in her neck, which could not have happened from a simple fall. Then came the digital evidence. The prosecution presented GPS data, phone records, and Bob's damning search history, his online inquiries about forensic timelines, post-mortem bruising, and how to stage an accident. The jury listened intently, their faces unreadable, but there was a shift in the energy of the room. The weight of the evidence was undeniable. Still, Bob remained composed, showing no visible cracks. His attorney argued that none of this was direct proof of murder, that Bob's research was nothing more than curiosity, that GPS data didn't prove intent, that bruises could have occurred from everyday activities. But then came the most critical moment, the prosecution's final evidence, the discovery of the plastic bag in the secluded park. The courtroom fell silent as the prosecutor held up the photos, displaying the discarded earrings, the broken strap of Stacy's nightgown, the undeniable attempt to dispose of evidence. Bob's mask slipped for the first time. His hands clenched slightly. His breathing changed. It was fleeting. Only those watching closely would have noticed. But for the first time, there was something in his eyes beyond cold calculation. There was fear. The case was no longer just circumstantial. It was irrefutable. When the prosecution rested their case, there was an air of certainty. The defense could argue technicalities, attempt to muddy the waters, but the truth had already been laid bare. Bob Feldman was no longer a man fighting against an unfair accusation. He was a man fighting against inevitability. The air inside the courtroom was thick with anticipation. Weeks of testimonies, forensic breakdowns, and legal arguments had led to this moment, the final stretch. The prosecution had delivered a devastating case, weaving together the physical, digital, and circumstantial evidence into a narrative that was impossible to ignore. The defense had fought back, but the cracks in their arguments had only widened as the trial progressed. Now it was time for the jury to decide. The courtroom was silent as the judge called for closing arguments. The lead prosecutor, a seasoned litigator with a sharp mind for detail, stepped forward with the calm confidence of someone who knew their case was ironclad. She reminded the jury of Stacy Feldman, the woman at the center of this case. Not just a victim, but a mother, a friend, a person who had trusted the wrong man. She painted the full picture of Bob's deception, his affairs, his lies, his growing desperation when Stacy finally decided she was done with him. She replayed the evidence in their minds, the autopsy that proved Stacy had been strangled, the bruises on her arms, the broken cartilage in her throat, the missing timeline where Bob's phone had gone dark, the GPS records that led investigators to the secluded park where he had attempted to discard the evidence. Then the most damning piece of all, his search history. How long do bruises last after death? Can strangulation look like an accident? How to stage a fall? It was not the curiosity of an innocent man. It was the blueprint of a murderer. The defense attorney, knowing the weight of what they were up against, made one final attempt to sway the jury. He argued that no one had witnessed the crime, that circumstantial evidence could be misleading. He painted Bob as a man grieving under a microscope, his actions misinterpreted, his worst moments exploited. But the words rang hollow, because Bob Feldman was not a man wrongfully accused. He was a man caught. After closing arguments concluded, the jury was dismissed to deliberate. The wait began. Bob sat motionless at the defense table, his hands clasped, his jaw locked in place. He still hadn't shown anger, nor panic, only quiet calculation. But this time it was different. His control wasn't a display of confidence. It was the expression of a man who realized for the first time that he might not talk his way out of this one. Hours passed, then a full day. The courthouse remained on edge as everyone awaited the final decision. Then just after noon on the second day, the word spread. The jury had reached a verdict. The room filled quickly. Family members clutched one another's hands. Reporters whispered to each other, cameras flashing as the bailiff called for silence. Bob sat stiffly as the jury filed back in. 12 men and women, their expressions unreadable. The foreperson stood, unfolding the piece of paper that held Bob Feldman's fate. The judge asked for the decision. And then, in a voice that cut through the heavy silence, "We, the jury, find the defendant, Robert Feldman, guilty of first-degree murder." The words struck the room like a thunderclap. A gasp rippled through the gallery. Stacy's loved ones exhaled sharply, their grief momentarily swallowed by relief. Tears spilled down faces. Justice, long overdue, had finally arrived. For the first time, Bob Feldman's mask cracked. His lips pressed together, his face tightening. He blinked rapidly, as if trying to process the moment. But there was no escaping it now. The judge thanked the jury, then turned to Bob. A sentencing date would be set. But there was no question. Bob Feldman would spend the rest of his life in prison. As he was led away in handcuffs, there were no goodbyes, no final pleas for innocence, only the realization that his years of manipulation, deception, and control had come to an end. Justice had spoken, and Stacy Feldman's voice had finally been heard. The courtroom had emptied, but the echoes of the verdict lingered. Outside, reporters crowded the courthouse steps, broadcasting the final chapter of a case that had captivated and horrified the public. The headlines would run for days. An affluent Denver man, a respected figure in the community, had been convicted of murdering his wife in cold blood. But for those who had loved Stacy Feldman, this was not a story. It was a reality they had been forced to endure, a truth they had lived through every single day since her life had been stolen. In the days that followed, Bob Feldman was formally sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge's words were firm, unwavering. This was not just about one act of violence. It was about a pattern of manipulation, deceit, and control that had culminated in the ultimate betrayal. For Stacy's family, the sentencing brought relief, but not closure. There was no true closure in cases like these, only the painful acceptance that justice, while served, could never undo the loss. Her children, now forced to grow up with the knowledge that their father had murdered their mother, faced a reality no child should have to endure. They would forever be marked by the tragedy, by the betrayal. But they had also seen something else: strength. The strength of a community that had fought for the truth. The strength of law enforcement officers who had refused to let a staged accident go unchallenged. The strength of a mother who had faced the darkest moment of her marriage with courage, even if she hadn't lived to see its resolution. This case became more than just one man's crime. It became a lesson. It was a reminder that domestic violence is not always loud. Sometimes it hides behind smiles, behind reputations, behind well-maintained homes and carefully curated images. It is in the controlling behaviors, in the isolation, in the slow erosion of freedom. It is in the way some people believe they own those they claim to love. Stacy had almost escaped. She had found the truth and was ready to take back her life. But she never got the chance. Her story, however, would not be forgotten. In the aftermath of the trial, awareness around domestic abuse and coercive control grew. Advocacy groups used Stacy's case as an example of why victims must be believed, why subtle signs should never be ignored. Friends and family members, once unsure of how to help a loved one in a toxic relationship, started asking harder questions, offering support before it was too late. And Bob? He would spend the rest of his days behind bars, stripped of the power he had so desperately clung to. No manipulation, no control, just the slow, inevitable passage of time in a cell that could never be as carefully staged as the life he had tried to build. Justice had been served, but the lesson remained. Love should never be a cage. Power should never replace compassion. And the truth, no matter how deeply buried, will always find a way to rise. Thank you for watching our video. Please subscribe, follow us, and leave a comment. It truly helps us keep bringing you gripping and thought-provoking true crime stories.